As I watched my father pound his steed ahead down a rugged dirt path through the dense forest heavy with smoke, ash, and fire flurries, with my mother holding my little sister in her arms, followed behind and me behind them. Even though we were many miles outside of the city gates, I could hear the timbers and stones of the buildings collapsing, punching out the terror of screams drenched like an everlasting agony, and our home was burned. As our horses bellied, coughed, and snorted snot into the hot night air through the foliage of autumn, where the leaves were once a vibrant rainbow, now was coated in a translucent layer of gray from the ash and wood, the forest held a dark gloom over it. Carriages rattled past us in terror. Men, women, and children carrying their things were in panic, bolting for the town behind us, Yorkshire. I could hear powder shots being fired off in the distance. The fire was driven men mad with greed of looting every precious little golden glinted gem from the chests and stores upon the outside village beyond London. "Father!" I called over the screaming of the people barging past us and peering up at us like we were unnatural for heading towards the burning city. He could not hear me, so I pinched my horse in with my boot heels, which made the beast yelp and gallop around my mother and sister. "Father!" I called again. This time he heard my voice and turned his head as his long gray locks flapped like wispy yarn behind his head. "What the bloody hell is it, son? Why are we heading for the city? Surely we're making haste towards Yorkshire, or better yet, Westminster." "Nonsense! We must make way to Plymouth, lad. In Plymouth we can start anew, buy a house with supplies from our home. I made sure to store winnings of gold on my horse's back saddle. Purchase just that. A farm, a new house, a new life. We must get to the harbour and board a ship on its course before the city turns into Satan's play stage." "Yes, sir. Mother, are you ill? How's Maria faring?" "No, I am fine, but your sister is slightly warm to the touch. We fear she has been falling with fever from the night air. I've wrapped in blankets, but we must get to the harbour as your father has intended." I peered at Maria and saw my mother had her tangled in sheep's wool blankets. Only her face was visible and curls of her thick blonde hair. We must make it. I could feel the horse's hooves stumbling under its long, muscular legs, sweat drenching its fur and the fire smoke entering its lungs. My bags were upon me, carrying gold, my musket, my pirate sword, a sharp cutlass, a pair of fine brandished double Danish barreled pistols, a pair of clothes, and water. It was as if my father had seen London's end. Then my mind ran to what me and him encountered within the market a week before this day. Of an old man standing upon a pile of old apple crates, praying, jabbering, and bartering. Such nonsense about London's end in a fiery hell that the buildings will churn to black stalactites like a cavern, a horrifying demon maw of fangs, the streets littered with crimson blood, the air floating gray ash as if it had snowed from a volcano eruption. The need for a ship to be acquired was most incessant. "Yeah, onward!" I screamed at my horse to gallop faster down the path. A grove of cedars appeared before us, and dead center on the path was a blockade built with 3 carriages, stripped of their horses with barrels of powder lined like barracks. A group of 5 men, each hold a rifle, was yelling at a herd of horses. A long bearded man aimed his fat sloppy finger at us, and his rugged white neck sash flapped in the fiery wind. "They got gold! See that glittering English chest with gems and sparkling jewels? I see the chest on the man's horseback. Shoot them, so help me God, shoot them! Or I'll fry the skin off your backs, you poor fucking gutter snipes!" One bandit cried out. They let out a volley of musket fire from the block of carriages that probably was once a cargo for flowers, spices, and lead. The bullets zipped through the air, making the horses plunge in fury. My mother screamed from the fire, which awoke Maria, who began to sob frantically at the constant bulge of terrible sounds of musket fire and yells. A ball struck my father's steed, dead in the center of the chest, and blood slapped its flanks in a crimson stream. The great beast let out an agonized scream, and its legs twisted from under it as my father was hurled from his saddle and came rolling across the ground in a mixture of mud and clothes. The horse's body catapulted into the air and landed onto my father's left leg and pinned him down as his chest of gold flew into the night air and rained like freshly minted pennies in the night sky. My father screamed in a bloody murder yelp as his leg was being crushed under the weight of the horse. "Father!" I screamed in worry and irritation at the raiders who had done this business. They began to reload and gave me a chance to ride over to the fallen animal where my father was pinned down. My mother and little sister drew their horse behind an old tall oak and slid off the side of the saddle and dashed behind a tree to take cover from the volleys. I leaped off my horse and slid behind a tree with my mother and sister. "Mother, keep Maria at bay." "No, Henry, you must stay here." "Hal, stay!" "I am sorry, I will be hasty. I must attend to father. I promise, my little pumpkin, I shall be right back. Protect mother, will you? With your witchery powers, remember?" I said, trying to give her hope as a musket ball stabbed into the bark behind me and us. "I shall, brother. I'll protect you and mother from the flying metal with my butterflies." "Perfect!" I yelled. I peered at the slumped beast with my father pinned under it. "Father, are you injured poorly?" I screamed. He waved his palm weakly. "Other than my down leg, being crushed, I'm doing swell, son." A spew of musket balls plumped into the oak, splitting the bark, making Maria scream, and dug into my mother's arms. I ran to my father, who was pinned under its weight, and I knew his leg would be a mashed up mess. My blood pounded in my earlobes as I slid with a musket rifle in hand. A musket ball pierced into the dirt next to me, causing leaves to flutter, and I bounced against the deceased bone. They let out another volley, and then began to stuff another lead ball down the barrel with the ramrod. I kept my back against the bloody brown fur and peered over the side of the stomach of the beast as the raiders began to reload, while the leader, which was the bearded man, sent two of them to retrieve the spilled gold chest from the path ahead.
"How many of them are there?" I huffed.
My father slipped out a tiny tube of a telescope he used to use on his sailing expeditions in the West Indies, and leaned back, extending it at the blockade with one eye closed.
"There are 5 of them. Do you see them, son?" He handed me the glass tube. "I do. 2 are hiding behind the iron carriage, with the other 3 are in the front rank. You're going to have to apply your aim with your musket well, sir. Take down the first 2, and then flank the 3 from the left."
My father pointed down towards a narrow dirt pathway that snaked through the forest and banked left towards the carriage blockade. It was so dark in the oak forest, only the silvery loom of the moon provided us light, through the dense heavy fog that hung low on the ground like some white quilt. Another volley let out, of which a gout of orange flame and silver smoke, but they sailed overhead. I looked ahead of us to see the 2 horses tethered with their large black reins to the oaks, and below, hiding behind a large tree, was my mother Lila, clutching Maria close to her chest, as Maria tried to gather energy to summon her butterfly minions. I couldn't help but feel distraught at her innocence in this matter we are in.
"Damnable bandits! What the hell are they aiming at? We're both Englishmen!" I yelped. "A thing or two you need to know of disasters, son. No matter where you were from, no matter your upbringing or station, background or family, any man will go greet you when chaos has ensued, and London is in a great fire at this hour. It is a great problematic matter."
I looked towards my father's leg buried under the steed.
"Are you alright? Is it broken?" "No, I don't think so, but it's smashed, son. My leg is bruised, I am sure of it," he muttered through sucked-in pain breaths. "I shall try to move the base from your leg, but I must take these men out, sir," I said. "No, damn you! You must leave me. Take your mother and sister and flee for the harbor." "I shall not!" I screamed with saliva dripping from my lips. I could not imagine a life without this powerful tower over me. "I shall try to free you." I tried to push with all my might against the beast, but it was no use. The animal was dreadfully heavy. "It's no use, lad!" My father hollered over the fire. "Get a move on! Take the lads that attach to the beast and flee towards Plymouth." "No!" My father clutched my shirt collar. "Damn your stubbornness, boy! But you were just like me when I was your age. Curious, stubborn, but above all else, brave. You do as you're told! Let me fight my own demons!" He spittled on my face with rage. "No, father! Methinks of Maria and mother. You cannot leave them, or me," I shouted. "I love you!" My father held a firm look into my hazel eyes, sending me a quiet message in between this devilry. A message of love. By God, I've raised him well. Never leave a man behind. Musket balls pelted the horse's flanks and some bones flew up. "Son, you're going to have to fire at them."
Father, I cannot. I'm too frightened.
My father pulled me close to where his whiskers tickled my chin. You can do this, son. Like I've taught you for the many years and thereafter. You saved my life from the madmen out in the fields. Your mother and Maria, your little sister, believes in you. Remember, you can do this. Steady your aim with the bead at the end of the barrel. Hi, sir. I cocked my jaw and set my eyes. I pulled the musket rifle up against my shoulders and drew it back half-cocked so I could pour the powder down the barrel. The raiders let out another musket volley, hitting up the flesh of the horses to where its stomach was torn to shreds in a mash of orange fluids and red bloody spleens, and I saw its liver plop out like a dead fetus, the size of a 9-pounder cannon barrel used from Spanish ships. Pull the black gunpowder, but do not let it get wet or it will not light. With careful attention, I pulled out of my breeches a pocket of a wad of white papering that held the powder. I ripped it open with my teeth, spit it out, and I slipped the black powder into its hold, careful not to let the dew from the grass to get it wet. Use the ramrod. I slid the metal thin rod that was placed into the rifle and stuffed it deep into the thin telescope of the rifle, shoving the lead ball and powder together so they could catch a flame and spark the fire. I lit the slow match as it spluttered a fiery red flame in the matchlock. The horse was pelted up from musket balls and its body convulsed in a strange manner, which as if it was still alive, and I could hear my father's leg bone crunch like a peanut brittle. He wailed in pain. I laid the rifle along the side of the beast's fur and aimed the long musket at the two men, laced in leather jerkins and wool pants charging toward the glittering gold that gave off a haunting ethereal glow from the fire of the city. They were going to steal my father's and my family's earnings for the past 10 years since the 1650s, and by God, I was not going to let them succeed in stealing it, just like the many countless other carriages they've emblazoned with their debauchery this night. I could see a pile of corpses, 2 children shot in the head, dry blood painted on their foreheads, and a woman in tattered dresses, and a wigged man, but his wig was taken and removed, revealing his bald head. His throat was slit. I steadied my aim and kept my one right eye on the bead while my left one was closed. My father yelped again, and I flickered my eyes away from the barrel for a split second and flicked my hazel eyes back at the two men, nearly 10 yards from the chest. Father, we must move your leg from under this. Never mind that. Focus on this matter. But father, focus! I stared at him amazed that it seemed that the pain has fled his body, and it was as if he had felt nothing at all. I readjusted my aim downward to the men's legs as they sprinted to the treasure chest. The two men now was at the chest as they struggled to pick it up under their weight. On the leafy ground of the autumn oaks. Powder set? Yes, sir. Take back to full cock. I quickly drew back the cock arm and placed my finger on the trigger. Remember, lad, like I taught you. Breathe slow, steady your aim, shoot home. Remember, it's no different than shooting a deer or a rabbit out in the fields when we are hunting. You can acquire this, son. Line your eye up. Yes, sir. The rifle shook in my hands and the weight of it seemed twice its actual weight like an anchor. I watched the 2 gruffy raiders wearing a pair of leather-torn jerkins and nasty cow leather boots, caked in shit, then stumble at the chest, spilling some gems out as they struggled back to their barricade. Don't spill any of that precious gold, you damn idiots! We need to spend all that on whores the fucking barrels of rum in Liverpool! The leader of this little gang shouted at the 2 men. My blood pumped through my ears, my heartbeat slowed, and my breast seemed to freeze into frost. I fired the rifle, and the ball sliced through the man's back and went clean through with a spray of crimson that splattered on the chest, lit and rained down like it had been raining blood from above. His body slumped, and he rolled onto his side lifeless. The chest was so heavy that it smashed onto the other man's boot, and he yelped like a wounded bull. Oh, fucking sakes and all the Marys! And then screamed to the heavens, his deep voice rising to a crescendo. I could hear his toes crunch from here, and he slagged forward, trying to free his footing as his accomplices began to shout at him insults to hurry up. Free your tiny foot and get a move on, one yelled. Come on, Billy, you fucking devil, and we'll split your guts to Satan's teeth. Another yelled, I'll cut your wages! I quickly reloaded the musket rifle, and before I knew it, I had already fired it. The ball shot clean through the man's neck from the side, and his skin from the flaps of his jaw sang outwards, and his teeth tumbled out like nice coins being spilled from a leather bag. His face planted into the dirt in a puddle of buttery brains, red blood, and white chalk teeth. His comrades screamed and tried to recover their wits by reloading their rifles and pulling out their blades. No! When we have time to lift such an animal, it will take them time to reload the muskets, my father ushered. I laid my musket down and aimed my shoulder blades into the guts of the animal and heaved with all my might. It was one of the heaviest things I've ever lifted, and it felt saggy and lump against my back. It was like trying to lift a ship's cable from the underhull. With luck, the beast rolled over on its side, and my father's legs slipped free as I grabbed the tops of his trench coat and dragged him through the mud and leaves as he sighed with relief, free from the crushing weight of the steed. I dragged him back to where my mother and sister were hanging onto the reins of the horse. 3 other men still piled musket balls in our direction, but they missed overhead, and I felt the winds of the lead whip by my hair. I gazed at my father's left leg, which had been battered to the blood and bone. His boot smashed and crunched like someone had wrangled it through a cotton spinner. Blood seeped through his fresh blue linen stockings, and his bone chips were poking out of his shin. Watery, blood-tingled lips, green, slimy pus oozed out down to his foot. He groaned as he sat up and leaned against the oak tree. His long gray hair flushed over his bright red face, and his beard was drenched in spit. "Father, what shall I do? Your leg has beaten you." The musket ball still slapped against the tree. I am uncertain, although it must be binded with a split to stand. Lila, my dear, slip my boot off and wrap with a cotton cloth across it to staunch the blood. Take the water from our stone well we have established, and pour it on to rid the infection of pus turning to gangrene. Rip off some bark from this tree and line it down my shin for support. Yes, my dear. And as she commanded, she quickly sat up and began to pull the medical supplies from the saddle of the horse. She began rubbing my father's torn skin with the damp cloth she used from pouring on cold water from one of the leather casks. It stung to him as he groaned, but it wiped most of the blood away in pus. She poured a hint of green liquid called lily pod on to clear it. I loaded my rifle and gripped my father's shoulder. "I shall end them with a swift death, sir." He gripped my collar, his hands covered in his warm red blood, getting in on my blood-smeared cotton white shirt. "Be careful." I nodded and gave Maria and my mother a kiss. I waited for the next musket volley to echo through the forest, and then I cocked the armful back and began to charge forward. My boots slapped the mud at my feet, and I ran with full speed. I banked left down the path my father had aimed for me, being covered in the foliage of thatch, thorn, and thistle. My heart raced through my eardrums and pounded like the beating of a drum in marching precision to battle. My feet slapped through the mucky path, and I pushed through a patch of prickly pear thorns, which stabbed my skin and ripped my shirt like paper, feeling the little pricks of needles, but I pounded on with vigor to save my life and my family's. I sprinted down the dirt and then banked left and headed straight to the blockade at a side angle. They barely saw me coming, for I took a left around the carriage blockade, not straight at them, for if I were to do that, they would pelt me with lead balls in seconds. I aimed my musket ahead as I kept running towards them and fired. The first shot pierced the man in the side, but he stumbled, clutching his sodden red side, and stabbed himself on his own bayonet through his own head and opened his lips like a wide, wicked, and crooked, scully grin and slumped on top with it staked in the dirt. I flipped my musket and caught the butt and used it as a club and collided swords with the fourth man. With the fourth man wielding a long sword, that of a knightly oath, and which was longer at the point to jab at the flesh more easily than a shorter, stiffer sword like my cutlass, my father had presented me with from his strip in the Indies, where it laid over the fireplace with crossed swords, English muskets, and Viking pikes and battle axes, a more medieval turn in the house, when I was 10 and began instructing us to use it. The men slashed at my gun as I tried to helplessly fend off a blow, but his sword cut clean through, severing my musket in two, and kicked me onto my back. I scrambled up, tossing the broken weapon, and drew my sword and clinked steel on steel with the other two. I could see fear in their eyes. I slashed and clinked steel on steel with the fourth man while the fifth started back in dismay. Our swords ringed and danced in the night, more like the devil doing a dance in a sword brawl. Sweat from the intense smoke heat blinded my eyelids, but I kept pushing my blade up and down, strokes hearing the blade hiss like a snake. All the skills my father had taught me has come to fruition. We paced back and forth on the leaves ground as the screams of the burning townspeople echoed through the steamy fog of the night. My sword smacked against his, and he charged forward, punching his fist into my temple, which sent me reeling in confusion and dizzy. I stumbled back, letting my sword arm droop at my side for a split second, shaking my head deliriously and to regain my composure. The raider saw this as an opportunity and slashed its jagged scythe on my chest, which had an open embrace. I gasped in terror as the blade came sailing down with such speed I barely had time to react. But luckily, my energy was not vanished, and with all my brutal agony, I slung my sword arm upward until I could feel the blade collide with, and the impact was so deafening It was as if the whole forest vibrated with the steel on a silver shock, and the shock shot up my arms with such intensity that my teeth smacked together. I could feel the man's strength sapping, so I took the advantage. I pushed forward, driving my boot firmly into the muddy ground for a footing, and slashed to the left side with a dead hit parry, and the blades crossed, caught in a hilt and sparked bright embers. The English raider gasped. I grabbed his right arm and yanked him sideways. With the thrust of yanking him, my sword arm thrusted home. The cutlass sliced clean through his belly and out through his spine where I could see it protrude through his skin, and a skew of blood and bone chips sparked out into the ground. The man's legs gave way under him, his eyes lowered into his brain, and blood dripped from his chest as he sagged to his face. I put my boot on his chest and heaved the blade clear, blood spurts flying up into the fog. Just as I pulled my sword free, the fifth raider, who I had entirely forgotten was still alive, for I was so engrossed with the fourth man's sword duel that I did not have time to react to his blow. He slipped in a long silver dagger with a golden hilt encrusted with a red ruby and leaped at my throat. I jumped back too as the blade cut through the fog and whistling past my neck, skin barely, and feeling my skin tingle from the swipe. I was unaware that there was a steep hill behind us where the carriage blockade had been established, for the fog suckered it in seclusion. I tripped. I dropped my sword lined with red roseblood, but as I fell, I grabbed the man's shirt and took him with me. He bumbled down the hill with a mingled mesh of legs and leaves down the steep side. My vision was a kaleidoscope of fog, leaves, skin, and trees, creating an unfathomable spin. We finally tumbled to a stop at the bottom beneath the carriage blockade, and I crunched into a pile of stones which spiked into my spine with an aching pain, and mossy green old stones that had, from the looks of it, had once been an old grave many centuries ago. I wiped the mud from my face and saw the fifth raider crawling towards his dagger, which only lay a few feet to him, but he was slow and dizzy, stumbling like a drunk man from the roll of the hill. My vision zoomed in and out like a telescope barrel, opening and closing, and I struggled to stand on my legs. I began to walk but caught myself on a stone and stared at the ground to focus. Once my eyeballs readjusted, the man was nearly to his knife. I stumbled to him, and once upon him, I kicked his ribs, making me up in agony. I tried for the knife, but he swung his boots and tripped me, causing me to slip onto my back, and the pain sustained from the pile of rocks ached worse, like my spine was being twisted in and out. I rolled to my side as the man grabbed the dagger and flew upon me. Just before his hand was holding the weapons, he plunged into my heart. I was able to grab a fallen tree branch to my right, lined with silver webs and green leaves attached tiny twigs. On the web was a nasty fat black spider with long laboriously legs. Straggling across the silver strings was the blue strip back and began wrapping up a ladybug that had been ensnared in its trap. I blew the spider off and the bug floated easily away. I drove it against his right side, making the two teeth spill from his bruised lips, and the dagger skidded a few more feet away from us. The raider plunged onto his belly, gasping and spitting blood into the soil. I sat up quickly and leaped onto his back and gripping the back of his head, shoving it deep into the mud so he couldn't breathe. With all my might and strength, I pressed his white face into the surface as his legs did a little jig behind me and his arms fell like a man struggling to climb a flight of stairs. "You son of a bitch! This is what you deserve for befalling harm upon my family. You shall die with the devil in hell." But just when I thought I had him, he reached for a rock to his left and knocked it into my cheek, which sent me sailing in pain off his back. But the rock only merely clocked me for a second. He crawled with surprising speed to the dagger and gripped the hilt, but I was upon him again before he could make another jab. I leaped to my side and struggled with both his arms to keep the blade from traveling to my stomach as we lay side by side, breathing, groaning, and screaming with the blood running down both our faces. His bearded face was cracked in mud. His soulless green eyes held the look of death into them. I could feel the warm flow of blood dribble from my right earlobe and run down to my chin from his rock attack. I planted my boots against his legs to give me resistance and strength to counterattack the knife in the enemy's hands. I slowly brought my boot up and smashed his face as we both rolled away from each other. But as we just broke apart, he used his left hand to drive the dagger to my left side. I felt the blade puncture my skin, cut through the blue veins and red arteries, and sever my flesh. Warm blood ran down my wound, and I clutched the knife's handle. As I rolled away in agony, I felt my entire body tingle in pain, and I never felt before, and my face went starch frost white. "Oh, shit, that fucking hurts," I muttered. I screamed in pain as I watched the other man slowly get up to his knees and stagger towards me. I kept the knife in my wound, even though it felt as if it were on fire. I knew the minute I pulled it out, I would have no time to staunch the bleeding with my coat, for the man would be upon me, and I would lose much blood sapping my strength to protect myself. The raider grinned jagged cut tobacco-chewed teeth. "Looks to me, lad, you'll be feasting with the devil tonight. Your gun will be shining prettily in my pockets." "Keep talking, sir, or I'll make you do a dance in the hippie rope." "Oh, you're amusing, sir. Run, little rabbit, run." He circled me. "What are you, some wealthy aristocrat?" "None of your concern. Your only concern is your death will be swift this night, sir." I muttered cruelly. At this point, all sympathy for this gang of men left me. I was a man possessed. He began to run at me with blood running down his face, his long wispy blonde hair raining down his face covered in oil. Once he was about to flee to me, I gripped a hand full of mud and chucked it into his face, which blinded him. The mud caked his eyeballs, and he screamed, backing up, clawing at his face, with his nails to rid from the brown muck. Still grabbing the knife, I sat up and felt the wound open, which blood poured down, but I ignored the pain and stood on my feet, balanced myself, and tackled him. Knife still on my side, I punched him in the side of the face, making him split. Splits of lip flesh pulped to the nightly forest ground. The man reached for the knife at my side and began turning this way and that, the blood bubbling inside my veins, but I gripped his hands, and together we pulled the knife slowly out from my skin. The blade was lined with bits of my white skin, fresh flesh meat, and staunched in warm, thick blood, and the wound was a razor cut that stretched deep. I felt the blood travel down my flank into my breeches, but I ignored the blood gushing. I bit into his fingers, and my teeth sank into his bone, bit it off, tasting the copper of his blood, and he yelled in fury. He punched me in the side, and I stumbled back holding the dagger. He sat up and began to run at me again, but I swung my legs around and knocked him off his feet. I was on him like a wildcat. I jumped on him with all my might and drove the blade deep into his gullet, dragging it across his neck, creating a red, grim smile. Blood bubbled up and foamed onto my hands as he choked, gasped, and his eyes went wide, bloodshot, and his body convulsed strangely, like he was suffocating, struggling for air or having an exorcism, and then went still. Blood soaked my white hands, and I jumped off him, stumbling on my butt and breathing heavy, pushing my long brown hair out of my face, and gazed around my surroundings. I cut a piece of my torn jerkin with the bloody dagger and staunched the bleeding at my side, and it hissed a sting as I pressed the damp cloth to it. I wiped the covered dagger on my pants. The forest air was chill, and eerie fog settled around the area. My side ached in agony, and I bit my lip to ignore the pain and focus on another. I stared at the man's dead body in front of me. All the blood had been drained from his body, and now he was as pale as a ghost. The devil's smile stretched around his neck. "I am sure, Satan will be torturing you tonight in hell, you swine." I soothed my swelling temple and muttered sweet assurances to myself as my head throbbed. I had done it. I had done it. I smiled grimly to myself. As I sat on the covered leaves with my arm resting in my lap, I heard a voice echo throughout the fog. A voice I could not discern nor ever heard before. It was female for sure. There was no mistaking it, but it seemed to draw me close to it, draw me near like siren song luring a sailor to his drowning, watery fate. I gazed around the dense fog of the forest and saw nothing but continued to hear the angelic voice hum. It was soothing, like a sweet potion being slipped into my tongue, or a choir of heavenly angels screaming to God. It flowed through my ears like I was under some spell or witchcraft of a sort. Then I felt my spine chill, my hairs stand upright. I slowly felt as if I was being watched. I felt someone's eyes piercing through my skin. I slowly turned to my left, and what I saw I could not understand. About 100 yards a pace away from me, standing in the fog, I saw a ghostly woman appear to be standing on her legs, staring back at me. She was entirely white like snow, and her white garments were fluttering in the night breeze. The entrancing voice still kept alluring me, wanting me to come near. My mind became foggy and confused, like I had no control of my thinking. I slowly stood up and faced the mysterious master. Her face was pale, her eyes black coal, her arms long and slim, stretching to her hips. Her silvery hair tethered in the breeze as her side, and I had an overwhelming sensation of death overcome. "Hello?" But my voice was echoey, and I could see my breath in the cold night air. "Excuse me. Who are you? Are you lost in the wood, my lady? You must hurry from this place before you befall any more danger, miss." I called thinking she possibly was some stray girl that had wandered from the burning city of London, which still illuminated through the gaps of oaks in the forest as a bright orange light. She slowly raised her arm and lingered out a long, thin finger battered with old nails and bruises. She let out a horrifying, blood-curdling yell that exploded in my eardrums like glass, and I felt my ears pop. I dropped my bloody cloth on my wound and dropped to my knees, clenching my ears with both palms, trying to block out the wailing cries. The woman, nay, this creature, whatever it was. I could feel not safety towards it, only death. The female scream echoed and bounced in my brain like a never-ending song, like she was crying for a lost loved one, and I closed my eyes and screamed with all my might to get it out. My head banged and ached. My body felt loose and light, my muscles contracted and tensed, and the blood began to rush cold in my veins like a frost was forming a layer over the red. Then a terrible sound like a knife being ripped into a blade exploded in my brain. Then all of a sudden everything stopped. Everything was quiet except for this incessant ringing in my ears. I could hear no wind, no owls cooing, no fireflies buzzing, no creeks running, nothing. I dropped my hands to the ground and snapped my fingers on my ears and could not hear them snap. A sound like a dull drum being beaten to death. I tried to talk and could feel my voice vibrating, my neck an Adam's apple, but I could not hear my voice coming out. Everything was silent except for this ringing. I gazed up to where the ghastly demon was and she was gone. Nowhere to be seen except for the fog in her place. Only a deer stood there staring straight into my eyes, with black watery sockets, curved antlers, mucky brown fur, and a sloppy nose in its mouth. It blinked twice at me and retreated into the fog and vanished. I felt a strange surge of foreshadowing wash over me like an ocean wave. I sat up and pounded the dirt, but only pulses of my thuds I could feel, but no sound. I crawled and stood up, and then could hear something faint, something distant, but it appeared to be familiar. "Henry!" It echoed. It was my father. I called out my father, but I could not hear my voice, only the vibration. "Henry!" He yelled again. Then I looked up the leaved hill, littered with twigs and bushes, and saw him standing up bathed in the moonlight, waving at me. I slowly made my way to him, climbing up the dirt hill, but my movements were slow, like a huge weight sat on my back, wanting to pin me down to the earth. I breathed heavy and pushed myself upright to the top of the hill. My father was standing on his legs, and his battered leg was smashed to pieces, but it was held up by a wooden splint and bound and wrapped in a white rag cloth, but it was so staunched in red blood and yellow and purple ghastly pus that it didn't seem like a bright new cloth my mother had installed to him. He was leaning on an old wooden cane with a white lion head pommel. He was securing the treasure chest filled to the brim with our gold and closed the lid and had my mother help him lift it on the horse's back. I saw my shiny cutlass and golden hilt and picked it up, but no still sound came, and I slipped it back into my sheath of my belt. "My son! My God, what happened? Tell me, my boy!" My father screamed. I gasped and fell to my knees, and my father caught me but my weight punctured his wounded leg, and he gasped in pain, but his voice was muffled like the rest of them, like a glass dome that surrounded my head. I peered over his shoulder to see the two horses. Atop one was my mother holding Maria in a soft blanket from home that was used by the fireplace in the armchairs, and the other with an empty saddle for my father. "Henry! By heaven's grace, you killed them all! Or are you injured?" I tried to speak, but my mouth was dry like sandpaper. Only the ringing proceeded in their muffled voices. "My lad, your ears are dripping blood. You're bruised and battered. Why can't you speak, lad? Use your tongue." I finally muttered, but couldn't hear my own voice, but my father and mother watched in horror understood. "I can't hear my own voice. I can't hear anything." My father's eyes clouded with tears and turned to Lila. "Bring him some water. His mouth is covered in blood." It took my mother a second of staring at my state to understand what my father had told her to do. "Tell me, Lila, now!" "Yes, I am sorry, Francis. He is my son, too. I'm just as distraught as you are. You should have never let him take those 5 men to battle. He wasn't ready." "He was. Look what he did for us. He cleared safe passage to London for us without troubles." My mother handed my father a leather cow cask and popped the cork, which when popped, sounded distant and trailed in an echo. "Thanks, son. Get the blood off you. You're wounded in your side. Bring me a cotton cloth and dig out rosebud." Father, I saw someone in the forest. A white woman. Not now, son, just drink.
But Father, I cannot hear. You're just tired, lad, that's all. You push people too hard, Francis. He's only 16 years of age. Not to mention Maria is only 9, seeing all this death, blood, and carnage. Own daughter!
Mother screamed my father as he poured the gushing water down my throat, and the cooling fluid gave me new energy.
Do you not think I'm accounting for trying? London is on fire. Our home cabin is in flames and ash. What the fuck should I do in this matter?
My father finished pouring the last drops of water into my mouth and re-screwed the cork back on. Then tapped the cotton cloth to rid the dry blood and pour a pink liquid which stung a bit, but I hardly felt it and rebranded the wound. He slapped the bound cord over his chest and let the cask flap at his side.
Damn you, woman! Do you not care for the well-being of our children?
He barked, but their voices were just distant bells in my head. Maria began to sob for my mother.
Mama, stop arguing!
She cracked through the blanket.
I am dearly sorry, my little one, but your father is being a stubborn ass. How dare you?
He barked back.
The things I have done and sacrificed for this family to get us a place and land of our own, the things I've had to do, toiling on a ship at sea while you were eating fresh exotic fruits by the fire at a homestead. You do not speak to me of this. Where were you when Henry broke his leg at the age of 8 from falling in a creek? Where were you when we needed your help with the children when you were gone at sea for some puny little errand for the king? Where were you when Maria needed you? All you do is neglect your family and forsake everything else. But you haven't even spoke to your damn brother in over 20 years, Francis. He loved you. You know, but you were too selfish and only cared for your own tribulations and desired to see it for yourself. Silence, you distasteful woman. Do not speak to me of ill relationships. That is not up for discussion.
Suddenly their voices hummed back to life, and then I could hear it again. The cooing of the forest wildlife, the wind, the crickets, and my mother and father battling verbally at one another. Enough! I screamed, which made them stop mid-sentence and eye me. I said enough! Arguing is not going to get us naught in this matter. We must make haste to London and get on a ship and sail for Plymouth, then Wales to meet our Aunt Margot in the farm. Our Aunt Margot in the farm sighed, like you said, Father. Your hearing has returned? Yes, I am all right. My father stared at me in disbelief, realizing I was being the calm one, not him. I was angry with my mother for bringing up a topic we are all aware was sensitive in my father's stead, but I understood her faults. It took my parents a second to respond, but Maria broke silence from horseback. Looks like Brother Hal was smarter than you, Father. He shut your trap with one word. And I couldn't help but snicker. My father scowled Maria, but in a good gesture. Perhaps so. We must make way to London before the flames reach the harbour if they haven't already. We resaddled the steeds and set off me riding with my father, and grateful that I could hear the poofs of the horses' nostrils, puff steam, and the galloping of the hooves when the wind blowing my long hair behind my head. As we pounded on through the forest on a path, my mother carrying my sister was behind. I muttered, pressed against my father's coat. I am dreadfully sorry for what I said earlier before the chaos began. I do not understand your meaning, lad. For yelling at you. I am sorry. It is past us now. It is quite all right, lad. I knew what I said was no short and honest either. For now we must focus on what lies ahead. Yes, sir.